For probably 50 years in social psychology, we were told that left-wing authoritarianism or left-wing authoritarian personality was not a thing. It was strictly a right-wing deal. And now you're starting to see some more research like what you're doing pop up. What are some personality characteristics that we see in left-wing authoritarianism that are different from right-wing authoritarianism?
Say it's not necessarily that it's different, it's the same, but it's just that the nature of authoritarianism, the prior work had always been cast in terms of, left wing, what do you think is a right wing authoritarian person? But now the work is actually developing items and item stems that really get at how would we, if we were to sort of want to know what does an authoritarian who's on the left look like, you have to word questions and items questions and questionnaires appropriately. So rigid thinking, simplistic thinking categorizes both sides of authoritarianism, left or right. But prior to really some of the new work, Costello and Luke Conway stuff, the questions getting at authoritarianism had always been, worded in such a way that it was beneficial to left-leaning people because every question they would answer was really attacking something that the right would have as sort of a normative belief, like religions. If you were dogmatic about religion, you would consider it a right-wing authoritarianism. But if you word that item, are you dogmatic about social justice? Well, then you're a left-wing authoritarian. So it really gets into how you phrase the item to measure the construct. And prior to this new work, it was all done in such a way that all the questions were naturally packed so that any answer was going to lead to sort of a higher score for right-wing authoritarianism. But once you start to generate items that are more fair, you can see what a left-wing authoritarianism person would look like. So, that's a good rigid thinking, simplistic thinking. Those are two of the biggest ones that characterize left-wing authoritarians.
I'm imagining that it would be more difficult to structure a survey for left-wing authoritarianism because so much of their ideology, the language is coded or maybe hiding behind the language of compassion and empathy. And so you kind of have to get behind that to understand what's really underneath.
Yeah, you do. And one way you do that is just by having researchers who are fair and balanced in their question items. So even with the mangling of language by left-wing progressives to sort of hijack this notion of compassion and empathy, if you word items around the basic concepts of the authoritarian personality, you can avoid some of that language mangling that they do. And so some of the sort of the best measure that I've seen so far that I'm integrating into research that I plan to do in the new year is this Costello Left-Wing Authoritarian Index. And it's, I think, a 39-item measure, but it gets at all these constructs of the left-wing authoritarian person by wording items in such a way that sidestep dealing with all that language manipulation that the left does. So yeah, it is difficult.
I'm wondering, do you see personality characteristics or different traits that show up differently in left-wing authoritarianism?
My hypothesis is going to be, and this might be a little bit fine-grained for some of the listeners, my hypothesis will be that left-wing authoritarianism is associated with radical progressive ideology, and that's going to be associated with what we call this vulnerable narcissism. So your listeners may be familiar with a construct called the dark triad of personality traits, which encompass psychopathy and Machiavellianism and some others. But the real differentiating feature of left-wing authoritarianism, in my opinion, is going to be this sort of vulnerable narcissism component, whereas on the right wing, authoritarians on that end of the spectrum, it's really defined by more grandiose narcissism. And those two types of narcissism are very distinct. There'll be some overlap and some correlation, but they are very distinct and unique. And the emotional, vulnerable narcissism, really the key signature feature of that form of narcissism is this emotional vulnerability, this emotional dysregulation. And when you think about radical progressives, what does come to mind? It's just that they're unhinged. They're, climate activists, street theater, and even some of the social justice stuff, it's just a complete breakdown of any emotional control of their behavior. And so that's my hypothesis moving forward, but we'll see what shakes out when I do the actual research.
So this vulnerable narcissism you talk about, that's basically like the victimhood complex, where you're looking for more and more ways to identify in ways that are going to essentially buy you social capital in these left-wing spaces by identifying as a victim. Is that right?
Yeah, like virtuous victimhood. So essentially it is that exactly. So you sort of have this narcissistic entitlement that you're a victim and that you have justification for your claims to being a victim and so forth. And so you're entitled to attention and, attention and feedback to the extent that you are sort of a prized member of the group because you're a victim.
So like on the right wing side of authoritarianism or this mindset, it would be, look at me, I've achieved so much. And on the left wing side, it's, look at me, I've been so vulnerable and hurt by the system. Is that the basic breakdown?
That's a fair characterization, yeah. Grandiose narcissists are more like Trump, where they're just displaying their dominance and their sort of achievements. They're not necessarily engaging in consistent victimhood and whining. It's more of a dominating type of narcissism rather than sort of this petulant, weak, look at me, I deserve everything because I'm a victim narcissism. But that's a fair way to kind of, describe a general way of looking at it.